now is online rather than face-to-face, because normally any teacher training function at MOE is always a good alumni reunion time. But anyway, we are online, and here we are. So I believe Prof. Farrell will be joining us a little bit late. He had to go do his daddy duties and pick up his son at school. We're covering the three major Western powers today, and I'm going to be talking about the French. So I've just put together a few slides to try to understand sort of what's going on in the minds of the French during the period of time of the First Indochina War. So here we go. Now, we want to remember that the situation in Indochina during the Second World War was different from the rest of Southeast Asia, because for most of the war, the French stayed in power because the Indochina was under Vichy France. Vichy France was an ally of Germany and therefore indirectly an ally of Japan. So the French were not thrown out until the very end of the war. And I call it a semi-occupation because the French were essentially in power in Indochina, but the Japanese were there kind of keeping an eye on what was going on. March 1945, 9th March 1945, because by that time, the Vichy regime has been overthrown and the de Gaullist regime is in power in France. And the Japanese are starting to get quite concerned that maybe the Allies are going to invade Indochina and try to push them out. So March 1945, the Japanese basically overthrow the French regime, and most of the French officials go either into prison or into house arrest, and then a certain number of the military officers, if they're not arrested, go out into the woods and the forest. And this map here shows the French idea of how much resistance was going on, which is probably not really too accurate. But the point is that the French, from 9th March 1945, the French are no longer in power in Indochina. The Potsdam Conference between the German defeat and the Japanese defeat makes the decision that Indochina is going to be occupied by the Chinese, meaning the nationalist Chinese, the Kuomintang, to the north, and the British to the south. And the idea is basically that they're going to come in and disarm the Japanese. And there is really no planning beyond that point in time for what is going to happen in Indochina. Now, that's the French side, sort of the Allied side. What about the Vietnamese side? The Vietnam had a communist party since 1930, the Indochinese Communist Party. And it was led by the man who went through several different names in his lifetime, originally Nguyen Ai Quoc, and later known to most of the world as Ho Chi Minh. The ICP had been active since 1930 when it was founded. It had held uprisings, it had local uprisings in colonial Indochina, first a more prolonged one in 1930-31, and then a shorter one in 1940. And both of those were repressed by the French. But during the period of World War II, the ICP, known under the general label of the Viet Minh, were out in the rural part of northern Vietnam, gradually building up their power base. They were very smart. They did not try to take on either the Japanese or the French. They were essentially waiting for that alliance to break down, which it eventually did, and then for the Japanese to be defeated, which they were. So the Viet Minh spent most of World War II expanding the territory under their control out in the rural areas. When the Japanese surrendered in 1945, basically this was the chance for the Viet Minh to come in and grab power. And they carried out what is usually known as the August Revolution within a couple of days of the Japanese surrender. And then they formally established the first independent Vietnamese government under Ho Chi Minh's leadership on September 2nd. And this government became known as the DRV. And the DRV, or the Viet Minh, as they were usually referred to, this was going to be the main adversary of the French for the next 9 years. Now, what were the French thinking at this point in time, in August 1945? The French, of course, a lot of their thinking at the time was really based on the very weak situation that they were in, the very weak position that they were in at the end of World War II. Because even though they had come out on the winning side through the Allies, most of the fighting and the heavy lifting and the liberation of their country had been done by the English and the Americans. And this, of course, was something that was quite humiliating from the French point of view. So the French had not actually lost any of their colonies during the war. But what had happened was that the French Empire essentially became divided into factions. You had a certain number of colonies, including Indochina, that were loyal to Vichy, and then you had a certain number of colonies that were loyal to de Gaulle. So one of the key priorities of the French government in 1945 is to get the empire all together again as one unit under their government. At the same time, this occupation, this Allied occupation of Indochina had been agreed on largely without the French. So the French were not particularly happy that the British and the Chinese were being invited to come in and essentially take over their colony. Obviously, from their point of view, they would have preferred to simply go back into Indochina themselves, but they had been preempted from doing so by the Potsdam Agreement. In 1945, for the French, as I think we can say, generally speaking, for most other colonial powers, except for the Americans and Philippines, there was no thought of decolonization. America had already had a clear plan for independence for the Philippines, and that came shortly after. But the US was really unique in that respect. For the British, 1945, for the French in 1945, everything was about rebuilding and retaking the empire. Nobody in France seriously thought, I think, at that point in time, that they were going to have to give up any of their colonies, and particularly not Indochina. The problem was, and when I was doing my PhD thesis, because I was doing my PhD thesis on the monarchy, the Vietnamese monarchy, extending up to 1945. So I read a good bit of the original French archival documents from the wartime period. A core problem was that because Indochina was being run by officials loyal to Vichy, that meant that those French overseas who were loyal to de Gaulle and who ended up running the government, they knew very little about what was going on in Indochina. Because the people in Indochina had been keeping in touch with Paris, and Vichy, but they had not been keeping in touch with the Gaullists overseas. The closest Gaullist French to Indochina had been in India during the war. And a certain amount of planning for what was going to happen with Indochina was going on among those French in India. But it was very clear when you looked at the documents from late 44, early 45, they did not have particularly good information about what was happening inside Indochina. And the thing that probably struck me most, was that most of the French believed that the Vietnamese wanted them to come back. This was particularly true from March onward, because from March onward, they believed that because the Vietnamese had suffered so much and were suffering so much under the Japanese, therefore they were anxious for the French to return. Now, it is certainly true that the Vietnamese did suffer. Some of you may know there was a serious famine in northern Vietnam in the final months of the war, where almost 2 million people died. And the Vietnamese blamed both the Vichy French and the Japanese for that, and they certainly did not want the French to come back. But my clear impression from reading the documents at this period was that very few French policymakers really understood that they were not welcome to go back to Vietnam. And this is key. If we want to understand everything that happens with the French in Vietnam over the next 9 years, we have to understand very clearly that this is how they felt in 1945. virtually all of them, they did not think that they could reestablish the exact same colonial regime as before the war, but they certainly believed that they could go back and reestablish French authority, and they believed that that was what a lot of Vietnamese wanted. Over the period from August 1945 to December 1946, which is the period between the end of World War II and the outbreak of the First Indochina War, a core problem was that the French simply refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of Ho Chi Minh's government. And I don't think they took it very seriously. They only really had to worry about the communists in 1930-31 and then the brief uprising in 1940. And I don't think that if you compare, let's say, the Dutch with Sukarno in Indonesia, I think the Dutch took Sukarno a lot more seriously as a potential opponent than the French did Ho Chi Minh. I think they saw the communists as a sort of a small group of troublemakers that had temporarily seized power, and they were going to come in now and take it back. The British were very cooperative. When the British came into the southern half of Vietnam, they let the French begin coming back in almost immediately. Obviously, the British, as a returning colonial power, had no real interest. They were not going to go and sabo the French coming back to their colony. The nationalist Chinese in the north, they were not very enthusiastic about the French, but eventually they also allowed the French to come back as well. So essentially, the Vietnamese, the DRV regime, who is trying to set up a government in Vietnam in the final weeks of the war and the final months of 1945, they are being consistently undermined by the occupying powers who are gradually allowing the French to return. The French did not return as a full-fledged power yet, but they began to come back, and especially the southern half of Vietnam, they came back and took control of quite a bit of it. The whole period of time throughout 1946 is a series of essentially failed negotiations between the French and the DRV. I call it here a dialogue of the deaf because the core French position was, you let us come back and take over first, and then we're going to decide the future of our relationship. The DRV position was, you acknowledge our independence first, and then we will talk to you about the future of our relationship. With those diametrically opposed positions, it was very clear that they simply were not going to be able to come to any kind of common understanding. And some of the French officers and officials actually worked very hard to sabo the negotiations over the course of 1946. So it does not take a particularly teleological view to see 1946 as largely simply delaying the inevitable war. War really, really was inevitable, I think, because the two sides simply were not on the same page and were not going to be on the same page. The fighting broke out in December 1946. Most Western historians now agree that probably the Vietnamese started it, but simply because they knew that it was going to happen sooner or later. And they knew that they were not going to get out of this without a fight, and so they decided that they should start it earlier. This brings us then to the essentially 7.5-year period of the war itself, the First Indochina War. The French were determined to hold on to Indochina. This was very clear. I don't think that in Paris, they really began to seriously consider giving it up probably until about 1953. Certainly in the early years, they were determined that Indochina was going to stay in French hands. And as I mentioned earlier, they understood clearly that they could not go back to the way things had been. They could simply not go back to a full-fledged colonial regime. So they tried different schemes. There was something for a while, and this was throughout their empire, called the French Union. The French Union was supposed to be roughly the equivalent of the British Commonwealth, but it gave the French probably more authority over their former colonies than the Commonwealth gave to the British. The Vietnamese, within Indochina, the French set up 3 associated states, which were all non-communist governments, which were meant to try to keep French influence and a certain degree of French authority inside Indochina. The French did reasonably well militarily in the first couple of years, but by the early 50s, it was clear that they were not going to be able to do it on their own. And so they turned very, very reluctantly to the Americans. Why reluctantly? Because the French believed very firmly, and they were not completely wrong, that the Americans wanted to come in and take their place in Indochina. Certainly, many Americans, starting with Roosevelt, were very skeptical about what France was doing and had done in Indochina. Now, the French were successful in getting American support by persuading them that the war was predominantly an anti-communist war, not a war in favor of colonialism. If the Americans had really thought only that the French were fighting this war to stay in as a colonial power, they wouldn't have supported them. But turning to them, telling them that what we are fighting here is an anti-communist battle, that was precisely the thing to say. But what the French wanted the Americans to give money and to give help and material, but to shut up and not give advice. But as I always tell students, Americans, we never just shut up, right? If we give money, and we will always give advice along with it. The Americans insisted on having a certain degree of say in what was going on in Indochina, and they did not want to simply give money, give tanks, give planes, and shut up. But even with American aid, the French simply did not manage to reverse the tide. The First Indochina War, as with the Second Indochina War, it was simply not just about military strength. It was about political strength. It was about legitimacy. And so by the end of the war, by 1954, you can see that the Viet Minh and their Lao and Cambodian allies, they controlled a good bit of Indochina. So that by May 1954, when the defeat occurred at Dien Bien Phu, the French really had been defeated quite thoroughly militarily and quite thoroughly politically as well. So, moving towards Geneva. By the time of Geneva, I think that the French did have a very different view. Decolonization by 1954 was a much more viable idea, even if they didn't like it, but it was a more viable idea than it had been in 1945. By this time, of course, the British had given up India, and I think this was a big factor. If the British had still been holding on to India, I think that the French would have been a lot more reluctant to give up Indochina. One of the main reasons that brought them into Indochina in the first place was precisely because they wanted to try to counterbalance the weight of British India. But by 1954, the wave of decolonization, both in Southeast Asia and elsewhere in the world, was strong enough that the French could begin to think about letting go of the colony. By this point in time, also the Indochina War in France was pretty unpopular. Probably if you compared public opinion in France in 1954 and public opinion in the US around, let's say, 70, 71, 72, they were roughly comparable. So the French government had lost a lot of support for the war in Indochina by that point in time. And one thing that's very important to understand is that by 1954, things were beginning to heat up in Algeria. And ultimately, Algeria was much more important to France than Indochina was. It's not that Algeria necessarily had a lot to offer, but from the French point of view, Indochina was a colony, Algeria was France. And so the French, I think, saw the handwriting on the wall. They understood that they were not going to be able to keep fighting in Indochina and deal with whatever was going to happen in Algeria. So they're giving up Indochina to be able to then focus on to be then able to focus on Algeria, this was a decision that made a fair amount of sense. It's a painful decision, but it was a reasonable decision at the time. What the French were not happy about was that they really, by 1954, they clearly had to kind of recognize that American hegemony and that American influence was replacing theirs. And so their main kind of instrument, their main ally among the Vietnamese had been Bao Dai, the former emperor. Bao Dai was the head of the French-supported Vietnamese government. By 1954, Bao Dai was basically his whatever authority he had to begin with, which wasn't much, was in decline. And Ngo Dinh Diem, who was more favorable to the Americans and strongly anti-French, was rising. Diem originally came in as Bao Dai's prime minister, but over the next year, he gradually pushed Bao Dai from power and became the main leader of post-war Vietnam. But when Bao Dai essentially, his power waned and Ngo Dinh Diem's power strengthened, that was the main sign that French influence was giving away to American influence. So one of the main things on their mind at Geneva was, besides trying to have some kind of graceful exit, what was going to be France's role in an independent Vietnam. But that was something that was going to take probably the next 5 or 10 years to figure out. Okay, that's what I have to say, and thank you.
So before we move on to Brian, maybe I'll just give you some time to just recollect your thoughts and questions that you have, because after all the 3 presenters have done their presentations, we will have a forum where we will ask questions. So without further ado, I'm going to just pass the time over to Professor Brian Farrell to share his perspective on the British view of this conflict. Brian, over to you.
Thanks, Lloyd. Can you enable screen sharing for me so I can put some slides up?
Avinda, are you there? Can you just...
Yes, correct. I'm going to...
Hi, everybody.
All right. Done.
Okay, thanks. Let's see if I can find them. Where are they? There it is. Now there'll be the usual problem about getting a slideshow going, which is always fun. There it is. Play from start. So I'm going to give you a few remarks to follow up from Dan and to proceed, to follow from Bruce and to proceed, Dan, on how the British saw events unfolding in Vietnam during these years from 1945 to 1965. And I'm going to explain it in terms of the frequent reconsideration and recalibration of British policies as they adjusted to changing strategic situations and circumstances in overlapping circles in the region, Southeast Asia, in wider Asia at large, and globally. And this is against the backdrop, the familiar backdrop, of course, of the initial challenges of decolonization and Cold War and how they became tangled up in Vietnam. And I will point out from the start that for the British, rarely was Vietnam a first order problem in its own right. And on those occasions, a few, when it did become a first tier significant problem for the British, it was never as a result of any of their interests regarding Vietnam itself. It always had to do with how the situation in Vietnam affected other more important British interests or objectives or agendas. So with that in front of us, these are the 4 broad phases of which I'm going to speak. Initially in 1945 and 46, as the Japanese surrendered and the Second World War came to a messy and confusing end, the British focus was on helping the French return to Vietnam, at least in first instance, southern Vietnam in 1946 to the whole country. The years 1946 to 1953, there were several back and forth reconsiderations within British decision-making circles in London and in the region regarding the question of whether or not Britain should continue to support French efforts to reestablish itself as an effective controlling power in Vietnam, at least, if not wider Indochina. From 1954, from the Geneva Conference to 1960, there was a palpable reconsideration of British interests and policies towards the region as a whole, not just Vietnam. Vietnam was caught up in this. And this was driven by an even wider reconsideration of British global policy. And then finally, from 1960 to 1965, the British found themselves rather trapped in a dilemma of trying to decide between two rather different courses of action regarding Vietnam, and trying to decide whether or not they could dare run the risk of trying to run down both tracks at the same time. The underlying approach to all of this, and the point of conclusion I'll make at the end, is represented by this 1966 publication by Sir Robert Thompson, who was Defense Secretary in Malaya during the communist emergency in this period, Defeating Communist Insurgency, Experiences from Malaya and Vietnam. It was at the time a bestseller, and it presented what we now know to be a deeply flawed and very ill-fitting recipe for how what the British had done in Malaya could be replicated in Vietnam, with a not too subtle insinuation that the British had handled the whole problem of managing a mixture between decolonization and Cold War rather better than the French and the Americans. They were a bit too smug too soon. But to start at the beginning in 1945, 1946, it all begins with the agreements at Yalta in February 1945. One of those agreements being that Southeast Asia Command, the Allied command headquartered by the British at that time, Supreme Commander Admiral Mountbatten, would split the chores of handling the Allied reoccupation of Indochina with the Kuomintang, with the Chinese. Upon a Japanese surrender, Southeast Asia Command Allied forces, British-led forces, would move into southern Vietnam and disarm and repatriate the Japanese, pending the restoration of a political order. And the Kuomintang, or Chinese nationalists, would do so in northern Vietnam. Now, this duly happened with the abrupt Japanese surrender in August and September 1945. And so British-led forces moved into southern Vietnam and Kuomintang forces moved into northern Vietnam. To pick up on a point that Bruce made, the principal unit used by the British to restore order in southern Vietnam and disarm the Japanese was actually the 20th Indian Division, which you can see being reviewed in Saigon here by the French General Philippe Leclerc. And the problem with using 20th Indian was, like the rest of the Indian Army, it was not going to be available for very much longer. So while the British were quite willing to do what they could to help restore order to Vietnam and to return a French political authority, they were also aware right from the start that their own ability to exercise any direct leverage in this process was going to wane and wane quickly. Their strategic reserve in Asia was not going to be available much longer. They also had more pressing problems of their own in their own territories. And the principal reason why they wished to help the French restore order in Vietnam was they wanted to help France get back on its feet and recover more effectively in Europe. British plans for rebuilding Europe and maintaining order in Europe and stabilizing Europe rested very heavily on rebuilding the French as a great power which would be able to take its place in the line and help them with the occupation of Germany and increasingly the containment of the Soviet Union. The French government of Charles de Gaulle, who didn't resign and leave for retirement until the spring of 1946, was at the time determined to restore French control over the overseas territories. The British, the Foreign Office, and the Prime Minister's office backed him up, primarily because they wanted to help France get back on its feet overall, more important to them than any interest they had in Vietnam. So in this initial phase, British policy was to hand over direct responsibility for controlling Vietnam as quickly as possible to the French in the first instance. By the time everybody was clear of military authority and everybody had made agreements, and the French had made their agreement with Ho Chi Minh, who had said better to eat French shit for 5 years than Chinese shit for 500. I think that's almost a direct quote, although Bruce can correct me on that. The British had made it clear that while they were not uninterested in what was going on in Vietnam, it was not a pressing priority for them. Bigger things on their plate. To them, at the time, it was little better than marginal. All of that changed, of course, when war erupted between Ho Chi Minh and his communist-led coalition and the French in November, December of 1946. From 1946 to 1953, the British went back and forth in Singapore and in London between various different agencies and branches of the government. The Prime Minister's office, the Foreign Office, the Armed Services, the intelligence authorities, the pro-consular authorities here in Singapore. They were rarely united and only occasionally in consensus on the question of whether or not the UK should continue to support French efforts to impose a military control and continued political administration over Vietnam. A big development was the victory of the Communist Chinese in the Civil War in China in 1949 and their establishment of the People's Republic of China. After a relatively brief initial debate in January of 1950, the British government, to the consternation of the Americans, decided to recognize the new state and the new government as sovereign in China. This was not based on any particular illusions about the Chinese Communist Party or the People's Republic of China, nor any particular ideological or political sympathy for them. It was based on centuries of British experience on a different and more practical road towards managing strategic foreign relations. If there was an authority that could demonstrate that it was in effective control of a territory and a people, the British would consider recognizing the existence of that authority, and whether they liked it or not, doing some sort of business with it, whatever the situation might be. So in other words, the British were willing to appoint to adjust to changing political realities on the ground in the wider Asian region, which began a dangerous divergence between them and the Americans, one which almost all British players and decision makers did agree was potentially worrying. But that was quickly followed up by the North Korean invasion of South Korea in June of 1950, which came very close to establishing a really strong unified consensus among British decision makers, as the early and fairly long-lasting reaction was, this cannot be tolerated. This is a threat to the United Nations and the rules-based order. If it fails at the first test, we will have the League of Nations all over again. The American policy to work through the UN and militarily defeat the communist invasion of South Korea must be supported. So the British duly did so. They ramped up their defensive budget. They reinforced their forces in Asia. They moved forward towards supporting the wider American policy of containing what they saw as communist expansion in Asia. Enabling this, facilitating this, was of course the argument that this was all part of one overall orchestrated communist world strategy. And while the British were uncertain as to whether this was the case, it suited them not to dismiss that argument in public because it helped to justify their policy to defeat the ongoing challenge in Malaya, which they had declared in June 1948 as an emergency and recognized a state of insurgency led by the Malayan Communist Party. To repeat, inside Whitehall in government circles in London, there was never really any consensus as to whether there was an effectively orchestrated communist overall grand strategy. But publicly, the British government were content to allow the world to think that they went along with that argument. It helped legitimize their efforts in Malaya, and it underwrote and underpinned their decision to support the US in Korea. That naturally meant that when the French started to draw the connection between the emergence of the PRC in China and the escalation of their war in Vietnam, the British found themselves dragged rather willy-nilly along with the American idea that this must now be designated a Cold War war, that in fact, China was openly supporting and assisting and abetting the communist challenge in Vietnam, and the French were no longer to be regarded as merely trying to restore colonial authority in Vietnam. They were operating on another front in the Cold War, just as the United Nations were in Korea. Facilitating that British decision was a relatively brief but definitely effective tenure of command by General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny, who 1950-51 into 1952 took overall military and political command of the French war in Vietnam, and for a time appeared to be gaining the upper hand, pursuing a strategy which did some significant military damage to the Viet Minh and visibly improved the French position and their Vietnamese allies. Unfortunately for all concerned, de Lattre contracted cancer, had to go back to France and die. His successors turned out to be nowhere near as effective. The war in Korea dragged on. The war in Malaya, the British began to bring under control. And once again, decision makers in London and Singapore began to debate how best to respond to what now looked like something of a layered or a multiple communist challenge in different parts of Asia. What was the best British policy in order to respond to all of this? By the time it was clear that the French had a real military problem on their hands, the British were definitely having second thoughts. No question about this. Winston Churchill was back in office. Anthony Eden was Foreign Secretary. The British were trying very hard to breathe life into NATO in Europe, which was always their priority, to make it an effective military alliance. They were focusing on trying to rehabilitate the new Federal Republic of Germany and hopefully get it admitted into NATO. They still tended to see developments in Southeast Asia through that lens, with the exception of the Malayan emergency. So a very definite debate resurfaced in British circles by 1953. In time for this moment of truth at Geneva to be something of a pivot point. As the battle at Dien Bien Phu wound down unsuccessfully for the French, and the conference that was organized in Geneva to discuss both Korea, where an armistice had brought a temporary ceasefire to that war in July of 1953, and Vietnam, where the French were in the process of being defeated on the battlefield, which undercut their whole position at Geneva. This coincided with a British decision that they would need to reconsider their overall policy towards the entire region. Top photo here is Anthony Eden, British Foreign Secretary, with Zhou Enlai, Premier of the People's Republic of China and the media star of the Geneva Conference of 1960. To Eden's chagrin, because this was Eden's moment, Eden tried very hard to use this conference to be the platform from which two things would happen. One, he would position himself as the successor to Winston Churchill and take over as prime minister. And two, he would use British leverage diplomatically to try and anchor a British-directed policy towards Southeast Asia. In order to do this, the argument that Eden made was that the West would need to retreat from Vietnam in order to regroup. When the argument arose as to whether or not the United States should intervene with bombing from the air to assist the French forces at Dien Bien Phu, this provoked a pretty serious disagreement between the American and British governments. The British believed that the French were about to be defeated, and that military defeat had to be accepted, and moving forward, that had to be the base political line from which the Western powers should approach Vietnam, that their position there had effectively been compromised. The Americans were not willing to accept that. One of the last cards the Americans played before the French capitulated in Dien Bien Phu was to play on Eden's desire for something even more important: united or unified action. The overall British goal all over the world was to align themselves as the right-hand man, key partner, wingman, #1 junior ally of the United States. That would give them, they hoped, they aimed for, direct daily access to American strategic decision-making and calculation. If they played the role of the trusted ally, they would be consulted. They would have the key seat at the table, and they would be able, as the man down the bottom right, I'll introduce him in a minute, had once said, to be the Greeks, the old experienced veterans, guiding the Romans, the new, strong, young power, the Americans, as to how to handle the world. The price that Eden and the British had to pay for getting the Americans interested in Southeast Asia, but preventing them from intervening militarily to save the French in 1954, was to agree to form a collective security organization in the region, which would be expressly and avowedly aimed to contain the further expansion of communism of China, which emerged later that year in the Defense Pact in Manila and in the following year in the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. So while Eden got some of what he wanted in Geneva, a face-saving bailout to partition the country, to hold elections down the road, to give the French a chance to move out, he didn't get everything he wanted. The Americans had not yet made up their minds how they felt about Vietnam. They had been persuaded to commit themselves to lead the collective security of the region. But as far as the British were concerned, this was very much a double or mixed blessing. On the one hand, it meant that American power, the indispensable component, might be available. On the other hand, it meant that American decision-making had to be, shall we say, guided. There was an old joke made by one of the first Secretary Generals of NATO, General Sir Hastings Ismay from the British Army, who said that we put NATO together in order to keep the Germans down, the Soviets out, and the Americans in. But the Americans were the ones that needed the most watching. So the idea was watch and guide them by entangling with them. Here we are. But in 1956 and 1957, the Americans began to make up their mind as to whether or not they would support efforts by the non-communist political authorities in Saigon to resist the implications of what had been agreed at Geneva in 1954. When Diem was able to demonstrate to the Americans that he could effectively impose his dominance in southern Vietnam, they drifted towards backing him. The British were very undecided about this. This coincided with a change in government as Eden was forced to resign in disgrace because of the Suez Crisis, the emergence of Harold Macmillan, the man you see down here next to his American counterpart, President Dwight Eisenhower, and a great overhaul led by Macmillan, whose administration, whose prime ministership, began the process of a systematic recalculation of British global interests. From the years 1958 into 1960, the British government, led by the Foreign and Colonial Offices, subjected the entire British Empire and British global interests to a forensic audit as the British determined just what role they wished to play in the world and what role overseas territorial interests should continue to play in this. This would lead in 1961 to Macmillan, for example, going to South Africa and telling the South Africans the Brits would no longer support their policy of apartheid, that the South Africans would have to be mindful of the winds of change that were blowing through Africa. It had its effect on Southeast Asia as well. But for the British, this posed a real problem. A problem juxtaposed here by my placing Macmillan and Eisenhower together. It wasn't Vietnam for its own sake. It's what Vietnam might lead to in the way of complicating wider, larger British objectives or policies. In 1961, the British government accepted that in and of itself, Southeast Asia, especially now that the Malayan emergency had been successfully won, Malaya was independent, it was becoming a reliable British ally. In 1961, Southeast Asia was not in and of itself important enough to be a principal area of priority in British strategic foreign policy. So Britain should adjust accordingly. It was a small fraction of its global trade, a small fraction of its global adjustment. However, at one and the same time, and this really emerged in 1962 with the buddying up of Macmillan, the old veteran, and JFK, the charismatic young superstar celebrity president. This ran headlong into the prioritization of the so-called special relationship. On the one hand, the British Foreign Office in particular, with some support from elements of the armed forces and the Conservative Party, wanted to reduce British commitments east of India, which they argue had never made much sense since India had been granted independence and the Indian Army had been relinquished. On the other hand, because the United States was apparently deciding that drawing a line in Vietnam and defending the 1954 decisions rather than accepting them, right, was important enough for them to make a major commitment, which began in 1962 with Kennedy's commitment of American military advisors. This changed the calculations. The successive British governments and the Foreign Office agreed that the number one absolute total global priority, absolute, was that Britain and the United States must be working together, and Britain must be seen by the United States as its most important, most reliable ally. That seat at the table was to the British existential. So while they themselves actually wished there was some way they could begin to ratchet down in Southeast Asia, at the same time, the Americans appeared to be moving in the other direction. In 1963, the Foreign Office actually produced a very comprehensive report based on a couple of years of searching analysis in which they made a very interesting argument. They argued that the rhetoric coming out of Paris, where de Gaulle had returned to political office, he'd created the Fifth Republic, he'd become the president, and he decided to handle French defeat in Southeast Asia by arguing that the Western powers should step back from the whole region and try and get it neutralized in the Cold War, try and get both sides in the Cold War to agree to step back from the region. The Foreign Office argued quietly behind closed doors that this was the way to go. They in particular argued that while this might lead to some apparent short-term success by the communists, both in Vietnam and in China, in the long run, this was not going to lead to any comprehensive anti-Western power bloc orchestrated by China, because they were confident domestic indigenous nationalism in mainland and island Southeast Asia would, sooner rather than later, provoke serious trouble between the Southeast Asian states and the Chinese. In particular, they argued that while the Vietnamese and the Chinese might be cooperating at the moment because they shared a common enemy, in the long run, there was no way, with their shared history and baggage and general mutual relationship, that China and Vietnam would ever fall into lockstep and Vietnam become and remain China's loyal pit bull attack dog in Southeast Asia. The problem with this advice, as was seen by the armed forces, but also by the Prime Minister, Macmillan on the way out, but still in office, was that it would appear at the time in public to look like a colossal military and political setback for the West if they declared that they wanted the region to be neutral and they began to pull back militarily, and local communist forces on the ground then charged forward. And even worse, the Americans absolutely flatly refused to accept it. In fact, poignantly condemned de Gaulle's call for neutralizing Southeast Asia. That put the British in a real bind. To an extent, the Indonesians rescued them, but it was only very short term. When the Indonesians launched their confrontation against British efforts to merge the Malayan states with Singapore and create Malaysia, this allowed an incoming British government. The man on the left is Sir Alec Douglas Hume. In typical British way, in order to infuriate you by their eccentricity, he spells his name home and he pronounced it Hume. When Macmillan, a tired old man who had to give up on a scandal-ridden government, resigned in 1963, he was replaced by his Foreign Secretary, Sir Alec Douglas Hume, who quickly took advantage of a new president. JFK had wanted to try and get along with Sukarno. LBJ did not. And he went immediately to Washington and he made a suggestion. If you take care of Vietnam with our giving you political support, we will take care of Indonesia, relying on you for political support. LBJ agreed. So from that point forward, the British consensus was, well, if we couldn't get neutralization, we could at least be given a pass on having to play any role in what was looking like a deepening American commitment to Vietnam, other than saying nice things about it in public. They made the Cold War connection. They made the argument, which the Johnson administration accepted, that what was going on in Vietnam and what was going on in Indonesia were coming from the same root source, a communist-driven challenge to Southeast Asia. So at that point, the agreement was, yes, all right, we won't press you to do anything to help us in Vietnam, and you take care of Indonesia. All of that means that when the Americans go into Vietnam in a massive military way in 1965, and they start bombing the hell out of the country, which for the first time provokes a serious reaction from British public opinion, the British government is quite frankly trapped. It has decided that its commitment to trying and remaining the #1 ally of the United States is more important than its desire to step back from Southeast Asia to allow local nationalism to run its course and to reduce its expensive commitments overseas. I have finished. Lloyd, thank you very much.
Thanks, Brian. So there you have it. The French perspective, the British perspective, and in Brian's words, the new, strong, and young power, the US, being involved in the Cold War from 1945 onwards. So with that, I'm going to pass the time over to Dr. Dan Croswell.
Lord, help me out here. I'm going to get my face. Not that I want it.
Ted, need your help.
Forget about it. Trapped. Bruce Springsteen's song. The French got trapped. The British got trapped at the end, and of course the Americans launched themselves into the quagmire. I mean, nobody wants to see me anyway. They can hear me, right? That's all good. I'm going Clausewitz. So Clausewitz argues that war is a continuation of state policy by other means. In other words, if a state can achieve its agenda both internationally and domestically without the resort to war, all the better. And so when you look at the composition of state policy, let's call it grand strategy. Hold on, we got relief. No.